Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 46 following episode 2. And admittedly, this episode did not need to be 2 hours, but we still got plenty of content here, lots to break down here. But there are 17 players to talk about, and as always, no more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 17, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Jess. Now, Jess was obviously on the bottom for a lot of her run, and there was a slight chance she could have had a turnaround, kind of like what we saw from Emily last season, except she just continued to struggle a lot. And while there wasn't content about Kenzie not being trusted, I never really felt like Kenzie was going home here. I felt like it was always going to be between Jess and Bonu from this tribe. And obviously at the point where Kenzie wanted to target Jess and we saw how Jess reacted around camp, it just made sense that she would end up being the boot here. And I do feel bad for Jess in a lot of ways. You could clearly tell that she was struggling a lot out there with her not getting enough sleep and her not really building any game relationships out there, where she has admitted in her exit interview that she just didn't really connect with a lot of people on the cast and they didn't really give her much of a chance. Though at the same time, I do feel like she was kind of passive within the game, where she didn't really initiate game talks until it was a bit too late, which also fed into why it made sense for her to go out here. So again, I do feel bad for Jess in a lot of ways. And again, she did seem like a fun character in the preseason, so there's that. But obviously she is now out of the game, which is why she's here at number 17. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them. That way you can potentially be the next challenge beast on Survivor 47 and beyond. In this season, we have creator lockers. These are special bundles handpicked by myself and other Survivor YouTubers, along with creator trading cards. If you purchase my puzzle, you can get your hands on the Labyrinth Ball puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If you want to take home these puzzles and more, feel free to use my link in the description or use my affiliate code, Survivor Gumball, and start prepping now. And with that, there are 16 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off their edit and current game position. But at number 16, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Liz. And I'm actually a little surprised that this is the direction that Liz's edit has gone in. We're coming to the season, I was expecting her to be this big character that would talk a lot about the new era, and I feel like people would just get annoyed by her simply by her being too loud and energetic. When in reality, it seems like people are more so annoyed by her because of her flexing her businesses, which does seem like the bulk of her content here, where obviously in this episode, she gets her confessional about how she doesn't care about the money, that she's here for the title, and she's just going around telling people about like her career and stuff, and it's just paying a bigger target on her back. And again, the fact that this is all that she's getting and she's not really getting a chance to expound upon anything else just makes it seem very unlikely that she's winning the game from this point. Probably the person that I am the least confident about at this point, considering the premiere and episode 2 here. So because of that, I do have her here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, we have another person who I am pretty low on at this point, and here we have Bonu. And I feel like this episode was more of the same for Bonu, where he continues to be a pretty big character, someone that wears his heart on his sleeve, and it's largely working to his detriment, where he is still on the bottom of his tribe. And at the same time, like, we see people getting annoyed by him, where obviously he had his moment during Tribal where he talks about how he's wearing his heart on his sleeve, only for people to get annoyed by him due to him seeming like an unreliable ally. So obviously that's not particularly great. Obviously Jess ends up casting a vote for him despite both of them being at the bottom at that point, though obviously that was a self-preservation move on Jess's end. So obviously, like, it's not looking great for Bonu from a game standpoint, and even from an edit standpoint, while he is a big character, and you can argue that his, like, emotional approach to the game is one that Jeff would like, I feel like the show's not really presenting it in a positive way. It feels like it's being presented more so as Bonu being this big character that's there for a couple of episodes before eventually being taken out. And even if he has some longevity, I could still see him being like a Nasir, someone who's just kind of there within the game, not really dictating too much stuff until he's eventually sniped out. So again, I'm not feeling great about Bonu at this point, which is why he's here number 15. Now moving on to number 14, we have another person who I'm not feeling that great about at this point, and here we have Tim Spicer. And again, this episode is mostly quiet for him. Really, his only content comes after finding out that Mariah has an extra vote, and him being worried that that could work to his detriment. And all this is largely a continuation of his story from episode 1, where he was worried about the women teaming up, and he is shown being on the wrong side of that, where obviously you have people like Maria and Charlie who are on the opposite side of that, who are being presented in a much more positive light compared to Tim. So obviously I feel like all that's working to Tim's downside. And I feel like if they go to tribal soon, he's probably the boot here, just looking at the tribe and the relationships there. So I'm not feeling great about Tim, and I feel like the edit's not really propping him up, which is why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and I very much debate these next couple of people. I feel like the order of these next few could definitely shift around a little bit, but number 13, I did decide to go with Q here. And I did debate whether to have Q higher, as truth be told, I was a little low on him last week. However, I feel like after this episode, I couldn't quite justify it. I feel like he is kind of being undermined here. Where obviously he got a lot of content in this episode about him being in a great position on his tribe and obviously like dictating the action. And he was also one of the more vocal people in potentially targeting Kenzie down the road. And we even saw him entertaining this idea in his confessional in this episode, only for him to back out saying that he needs Tiffany's approval to do so, which didn't really make sense at the time, though considering where Jess and Bonu stood, I guess it makes sense from a game standpoint. But obviously from an Ed standpoint, it doesn't look great either, in the sense that he's openly contradicting himself. The fact that he talks so much about wanting to go with Kenzie only to not get his way there. So obviously that's not particularly great. And yes, while it makes sense for him to take out Jess here, in the sense that it's better to take out Kenzie later when he knows that he can pull in Bonu as a swing vote with him and Tiffany there, I still don't feel that great about Q's edit at this point. I feel like he's there mostly as a big character on the Yanu tribe, but beyond that, I feel like he's not really a contender for me, which is why he's here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who has moved up a little bit from last week, and here we have Randon. And I'm a little surprised by Randon's content here. Well, while he does get a decent amount of time talking about the beware advantage and him looking for it and him like realizing that he's on the bottom, he does later come around to wanting to work with Venus, which I do think is an interesting development there, considering that he previously did not trust Venus that much. But at the same time, I feel like neither Randon or Venus are primed to do particularly well on their tribes or on this season. Or while they could have some damage in the short term, I could also see it just blowing up at the first tribal, where maybe they continue to not trust each other. And I think Randon himself even alludes to this, where he openly admits to not trusting Venus that much. He calls her the ultimate liar, and he even calls himself a gambler by taking on this move, which I feel like could also backfire as well. So realistically, I'm not feeling that great about Randon to do well in the long term, though I feel like with the setup to him working with Venus, I mean, it could pan out. I mean, I don't think it's a guarantee to fail, but I feel like there's enough doubt there to where I have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Venus. And I think Venus is also in a pretty interesting spot, not that dissimilar from what I expected from her last episode, where obviously she has this high variance style of a story where she could either be someone that's just dragged to the game without getting much respect, or she's someone that flames out like not too deep in the game. And I feel like she continues to be in a similar spot, where obviously we got plenty of content of people talking about not trusting her and her just kind of being on the outs. We obviously have her like feeling like she's not being respected or listened to after the challenge, only for Soda to later say that she's being a baby. So again, it's not great content on that end. But at the same time, she also gets to align with Randon, and obviously that's something that could work out. But obviously I still have many reservations with that. But I still feel like Venus's longevity is in flux, where I could see her flaming out during the pre-merge. I could see her being like taken throughout the game, but not really having the respect to win by the end of it. Either way, she is a big character, but I feel like either way, it's not really leading up to a win by the end of it. I don't really see Venus winning this season based on the way she's being portrayed on the show, despite her being in a pretty understandable position with her being in the bottom and not being well liked. I do feel bad for her in that regard, but I feel like it's not really a winning position, which is why she's here number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and there's a debate for this person being below Randon and Venus. But I feel like this person could make it deep in the game, and here we have Mariah, and Mariah is just there. Her episode 2 was pretty lackluster, only one confessional, and that's during the Ben and Charlie game, which was kind of just there. And obviously she gets to have some banter with Liz during the immunity challenge, though even that's kind of nothing. I feel like Mariah should kind of just there on the season, and I'm not really sure what to make of her overall prospects in the game. However, I feel like it's not really leading up to a win, but at the same time, I feel like there aren't as many holes that could lead to her being an early boot either, unless she has like this big downfall in her boot episode. but I feel like with me not having as much negatives to say about her edit at this point, aside from her just being pretty invisible, I do have her here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I've dropped on a good amount from last week, and here we have Kenzie. And Kenzie is not winning this season at this point. I feel like this was a pretty bad episode for her, where while she does get some content at the beginning about how hard the conditions are and that her eyes look really blue after she cries. I mean, beyond that, she gets mostly negative content where obviously she talks about being this really social player, only for other people to talk about how she's a big threat to where even people like Tiffany and Q, these people that she's supposed to be working with, are seeing her as this big threat. And it's kind of interesting that Jelinski referred to this in his exit interview where he talked about Kenzie being a big threat right off the bat. And I feel like it's kind of paying off here where she's already being seen as a pretty big threat. And even beyond that, you have her like trying to play both sides by talking to Jess and Bonu, only for that to get back to Q. I mean, that was a pretty bad look. I will say that I was not convinced she was going home this episode, where I feel like it was largely a decoy towards a pretty easy Jess boot. But again, the fact that she's already being propped up as this big threat, and the fact that she's already getting this negativity is mostly bad, and it wouldn't shock me if she has a downfall relatively soon. But even if she squeaks her way to the merge, I can't really see how she gets towards the end, considering how big her threat seems to be at this point. So because of that, I do have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, we have another person who I have largely dropped on, and here we have Soda. And Soda is another person who is in a very tough spot from an edit standpoint, where yes, she does get to respond to some of the criticisms that Venus lofts at her, but then Venus comes right back and talks about how like Soda is this seemingly nice person, only for her to be really selfish. And I think what really hammers it in is that moment where it cuts back to them like being handed the immunity idol after the challenges, only for Soda to take it right out of Venus's hands. I feel like that did not need to be shown at all, so the fact that we are seeing it is a pretty damning sign in my view. Now, again, I'm not saying that Soda's going to be taken out before Venus necessarily, but I feel like the fact that she's already getting this negativity and it seems to be pretty unnecessary is a pretty bad look in Soda's view. And yes, while she does get to weigh in on certain things, I feel like the fact that she wasn't able to respond to probably the ultimate like insult to her is enough to drop her here to number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who is kind of quiet in this episode, but I feel like it's not really enough to completely write them off, and here we have Jem. And obviously Jem had a pretty quiet episode here, kind of like Mariah. Her only content comes like when she's talking about being a jungle gem and during the game where she like it gets away on that. Really outside of that, she doesn't really have too much to say. I will say that she stands out a little bit more compared to Mariah, and I feel like her episode 1 as a whole was better than Mariah's. So I feel like that's something at least, but really there's not too much to say about Jem at this point, so I have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who has gone up a good amount from last episode, though I'm still not that high on them, and here we have Ben. And Ben definitely had an interesting episode here, where right off the bat he gets to start the fire, and he has a whole moment out of it that leads right into his intro package about how he was like bullied as a kid, and that he's kind of found himself through rock and roll, but also admits to still having some insecurities within him. Again, this reminds me a lot of Cody's content from 43, where he got a lot of his personal content in episode 2 versus episode 1. So again, I feel like that is good for Ben from a longevity standpoint. And even beyond that, you have his relationship with Charlie that forms due to their game that they play, where they're naming Metallica and Taylor Swift songs, which was pretty funny on the whole. But beyond that, I feel like Ben is someone who is definitely emerging as a major character, but not really someone who's going to be a top contender by the end of it. I feel like he's someone who, again, at best, is probably just being set up for a journey edit, but could also just be like this big character that's there for a bit, kind of working alongside Charlie before eventually being taken out. So realistically, I don't think Ben's winning the season, but I feel like this episode was good enough for him to be here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and admittedly, this person didn't really go up so much as other people moved down, but number 5, we do have Tiffany. And again, I don't think Tiffany's winning by the end of it, and truth be told, I feel like Yanu as a whole is probably not winning this season, despite their challenged losses and being underdogs. But at this point, I feel like Tiffany is the person I'm the highest on. She seems to be in a very solid spot on her tribe right now. She essentially seems to be in the middle, where both Q and Kenzie seem to trust her a lot. And even beyond that, she has been getting some content where she gets to narrates the action on her tribe. After the challenge, she has this big moment where she's worried about being seen as the angry black woman stereotype for her behavior of the challenge, which is all pretty sympathetic. But really, I feel like none of this is really panning out to a season-long storyline that you would expect out of a winner. And I feel like a lot of it, again, just feels circumstantial. The fact that Yanu continues losing challenges, the fact that they had to keep going back to tribal, and obviously, even with that touching moment that happened after the challenge, that was obviously had to be shown due to it being this big, powerful moment. So, really, I feel like Tiffany is, again, being set up as a pretty big player, someone who will definitely have a lot of longevity on the season, but someone who is probably going to be cut around the mid merge, which is why I do have her here at number 5. Now, moving on to number 4, and we have someone who is in the same spot as last week, and here we have Teevin. Now, Teevin does have a similar issue to Soda in the sense that he does get a bit of negativity from Venus, where obviously Venus called him out for running the tribe and obviously not really building a connection with her. However, I feel like the thing that separates Teevin from Soda is I feel like Teevin has more of an opportunity to explain himself, and I feel like he's not as undercut compared to Soda, where obviously he does explain that Venus is someone that he just doesn't gravitate to, that Venus has her ups and downs, that she's just a frustrating person to be around given that she complains a lot. And again, I feel like the fact that we are getting Tevin's perspective is more of a pro for Tevin's edit compared to Soda's. And I feel like on top of him being a more prominent character, I feel like it is leading towards Tevin still doing well across the season. Now, again, I still have those long-term complaints about him, being too big of a character and him eventually being taken out. But I feel like the fact that he wasn't as undercut compared to Soda wasn't enough to keep him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person has sadly dropped from last week, and here we have Hunter. And this was kind of a mediocre episode for Hunter, where really his only content comes when he's idol hunting, and he talks about how he's going to find the idol, that his strategy of coming off as this easygoing southerner just looking for wood is going to pay off, only for him to not get the Beware advantage, which is obviously a knock. Again, something that did not have to be shown, and yet it was shown anyway. Now, granted, I don't think this knock is as big of a knock compared to other people we talked about. And to be fair, I mean, we have seen winners in the new era get some negativity. Again, minor negativity here and there. So it's not a death sentence for Hunter, or at least not this content. Though obviously, if we get more of it later on, then I will start to back off a bit more. Though obviously the top 2 still have cleaner edits up to this point. But obviously that kind of leaves Hunter here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have someone who I have gone up on quite a bit from last week. But number 2, we do have Charlie. And admittedly, I have these same fundamental concerns with Charlie in the sense that a lot of his story seems to be him on this journey edit, that he's here to meet new people and he's here to pop his bubble. And obviously his content here does serve that, where obviously he does focus on building his bond with Ben after he talked about how he needs to work on a social game. But obviously the big one being his relationship with Mariah, where obviously he compares that to Malcolm and Denise, which makes it clear that this is going to be an important relationship on the show. And I feel like mixing that with Charlie getting to talk about his game position, I feel like these first 2 episodes have been pretty solid for Charlie, where at this point in the season, he's definitely one of the more well-rounded people on the show, getting a consistent presence, someone who's getting both personal and game content, and still has this storyline of him popping his bubble that he's from this small town. So again, I feel like compared to a lot of other people, I am higher on Charlie compared to those other people, but it's still those fundamental concerns that he may be sniped out later on in the game, that he could just be someone who inherently may struggle to win a jury vote, kind of similar to what we saw from Spencer, who he compared himself to in the preseason. That leads me from putting him in the number 1 spot. But obviously, I was still impressed by his edit in this episode. I feel like he's still going to be a major character on the season due to this content, especially the relationship with Mariah. And it's for that reason that I have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 46 at this point is Mariah, who was obviously number 2 on my power ranking last week. But But I feel like this episode was very solid for her, where while she doesn't get too much content to where she's overexposed, she obviously has that one very meaningful scene where she built her relationship with Charlie, which again, I feel like will be an important relationship on the show. But at the same time, they compare it to Malcolm Denise, and we even see her in confessional comparing herself to Denise. And considering that Denise is the winner of this duo, I feel like that bodes pretty well for Mariah. So I feel like mixing that in with her very strong premiere, I feel like she's pretty clearly number one at this point. And unless Hunter has a rebound later on, I feel like Mariah could stay in this top spot for a decent while, though it's obviously still very early on in the season. There's still a lot that can happen between now and the finale. But I feel like for now, considering that most people have pretty glaring holes in their edit, I feel like with Mariah having a pretty solid one up to this point, I do have her here at number one. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. Now that Traders US has ended, I've shifted my focus to Amazing Race 36 as well as Big Brother Canada 12, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.